I was just about to be worried that
Well, I didn't see anybody here. I thought no one came. That was weird.
I got a message that said the user has another meeting in progress, was what I saw when I popped up, and I was like, what, Dan is cheating on us and has another book club?
That's weird. I wonder if
well, I wonder, after I've read what he's written in the last week or so, I want to see his credentials as a historian. How is it that World War II started in 1942?
I didn't say it began in 1942.
You did, December 41, actually.
I didn't even say that. I said my point was that Adler.
This book was written before World War II.
Before World War II began for America. Yeah, I mean, I think World War II began in 1931. So
no.
Absolutely.
World War II began at the end of the long 19th century.
Okay. At the beginning at Versailles in 1919.
1919.
So, but it's a toss-up, isn't it? Between, was it Japanese bullets against Chinese, or was it German against German in the revolution in Munich? Which one do you want?
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I will accept that criticism. Yeah. It's kind of, I mean, the thing that struck me was just that and really what was really in my head, I guess, was that it was before the end of World War II for Americans, when we got, this influx of GIs coming in, and we got this GI Bill that extended their transition back into the workplace by a year for many of them. Many of them didn't work for a year, millions and millions. And then also, college educations for regular people, which I think was a kind of a new and interesting thing. And then, my dad went on the GI bit, the Korean era GI Bill, went to college. So and then of course we had the baby boom. Then we had that further explosion of demographically. So that was really, I should have been more careful about the way I
was surprised. I wasn't quite shocked. I was surprised.
Yeah, it was. It could have been. I should have caught that in editing. Yeah. Anyhow, so I've been running around. I will be traveling a bit in October. I noticed a mention of that too. I didn't know that I was.
Yes.
I didn't know that I was bitching about it, but
it sounded like it.
Oh no, I'm looking forward to going to OE Global. I wasn't actually really even planning on going. I guess I will be going. I'm going to drive to from Bemidji to Regina on the first day, which is about an 8-hour drive. So if I didn't start until noon, I think that's possible. I think that's doable. I'll be back for the next one. So I don't know that. I mean, I guess I will want to think about that. I might want to postpone the Saturday the 14th, but I'll be back. I'll be back Thursday or Friday. So yeah, it shouldn't. I mean, it's not going to take. It's not gonna, huge chunk. Hey, Matthew. So I've been. It's kind of funny. I'm following I'm watching a guy who's trying to sell the entire set. He's trying to sell the 54 volumes plus a 10-volume gateway to the great books and a 10-volume introduction to the great books. But he's in Stephen Point. He's selling it on Facebook Marketplace, and he doesn't. I don't know if he wants to ship it. So I imagine it would take many boxes to ship.
If you have to ship it, it takes that many. Can be done in roughly 2 bankers boxes, and they're fairly heavy, like 20 pounds a pop, 30 pounds a pop.
Yeah.
But it's doable.
Yeah. Medium ale, so
Just a little risky in medium ale.
yeah, you think? Maybe, maybe yes. It's 6.5 hours from here. I don't want to jump in the car. I just drove 6 hours yesterday. I might, I guess if he wouldn't, I mean, it does look like it's a pristine set. So
What's he got as a cost on it? What's the
$200.
That's a good deal.
It's a
Wow.
swimming deal. Yeah.
Pristine, that's a good deal.
Yeah.
I would get in a car and drive for that.
I might actually pay him and ask him to hold it till Thanksgiving, and then because I have to go down and pick up my son and Stephen's fight would be a big kind of triangular move, but I could do it, when I go down on November 22nd.
It's certainly worth more than just sticking a penny black stamp on it. That's for sure.
It's more what? I'm sorry.
It's certainly worth more than just sticking a penny black stamp on it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. The other thing, of course, is I now, because of you guys, I'm going to blame you. I now carry a copy on my laptop. 6,500 pages in total. I mean, there's the 50 whatever volumes it is 5,100 and something.
Yep.
And then the other one's just over 11,000, 12,000 or something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Sorry, 1,200.
it was interesting because I listened to the whole. I mean, I actually sort of figured I'm going to be sitting in the car for so long, I might as well just listen to this. So I listened to the rest of How to Read a Book, and then I listened to the beginning few sections of Jaron Lanier's Who Owns the Future, which included the part where he talks about higher ed. And I don't agree with him about everything he says. It's kind of weird too. When I met Brian Alexander, he was like, "Oh, I can't stand that." He really he doesn't like. Apparently, they don't get along or something. And Brian Alexander said, "Well, I don't like that." Kind of. He called him a Maoist or something. So yeah. So
The other thing that happened this week in terms of roaming around Substack and similar was that it turned out I bumped into Mark Grabe, but Mark Grabe of like 4 or 5 years ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I sort of scrolling through the comments. Oh, I know that name. I mean, there aren't that many Mark Grabe. Yeah, it's
Right.
not like
Right. And he's tailgating at a Gophers game today, so he's not going to be with us.
Yeah, I mean, it almost was an Obsidian pop-up, but and I can't remember now which day of the week it was. I also got another exactly one hit on Google. I seem to be racking them up. I've got 2 2s today. But earlier in the week I got a single. I haven't had a 0 on for a while, but 0 is easy. You just put extreme Goldberry Gook in and you'll get a 0.
So,
and have anybody come across Jard Henderson as a YouTuber philosopher? He did one. I think it was one of the ones I linked to last week or the week before on his method of taking notes as a progressive thing from highlight to notes to now write it in your own words type progress thing, which everybody seems to be doing. But he does half of his content is either a book list talk or a deeper dive into a book. And he's got a bit doing the lists of books apparently, according to his one this week. But on this week's list is a random selection of good books to read, which I thought, oh, yeah, I heard that, Great Western Canon type thing, of which Debt by Graeber was on the list, along with Olivia Butler and Ursula Le Guin, just get a span. So it was a very mixed bag today, but it was quite a good little 10 minutes if you dip into it. And so I also made up a page inside this book folder, just to dump stuff on reading.
I saw that, yeah.
So it might be that I put Chard on there as well, but I can't remember. That's why I write things down. It's like I do remember my telephone number when I was 12, but if you asked me my telephone number when I was 20, I would have no idea.
I remember my telephone number when I was 12.
Because in all honesty, I never gave my number when I was 20 to anybody, and I never phoned it, because if I was phoning it, I wasn't there. That was my first year student number. But I remember my first house then, post university. And I used both of those numbers naughtily, really, because numbers have only got 10 digits in. To kick off top and tail, a phrase that I use as my main primary master password.
We're going to have to edit that out.
So if you think about which poem you might think I might save, you'd be entirely wrong, but then you've still got to top and tail it with two different numbers.
Okay, I didn't mention mine because I have used my childhood phone number in passwords in the past.
Yeah. And elsewhere where I need a number, I just take a slice out of somewhere randomly out the first 10,000 digits of pi.
Oh,
which is one of the notes in the notebook.
Let me guess which one then. 3.14159265358.
No, it's randomly in the middle of somewhere in the 10,000.
Okay, make 54329.
There you go. So today we had planned to talk about how to read each of these different types of books. And Mark didn't want to talk about poetry, but he's not here anyway. So if anybody wants to talk about how to read poetry, I didn't really focus on that part. I guess the thing maybe that I would start with would be this whole, they make a big deal about this whole sort of obligation to act. When you're reading, remember when they distinguish between theoretical and practical books earlier on, apparently the point of that is so that they can say to the reader, well, if you've agreed, then you must. And at the end, spoiler alert, they say, if you agree with what we've just done, then, get on with it.
The odd one there, I suppose, is if you sort of read, say, a book about Oppenheimer or Feynman or whatever, you could walk away with, oh, well, that's how you build an atomic bomb. So let's do that with the school chemistry set I've got stuck in the cupboards. Versus, here's how to grow some food, save your own seed and grow some next season. There's a bit more usability and profitability, community building in the second one than there is in the first, I suppose. But I don't think things like, I mean, I don't know whether you have it, but in the UK there's a thing called a Hayes manual. And the Hayes manual is a do-it-yourself car repair thing, but for each model of car. And with all the practical tips of, you undo this nut and bolt first, otherwise you get caught out when it has to rotate apart or whatever. And they're comics almost, because there's lots of expanded, blown up engineering type drawings of what the bit looks like when you put it back together again, and where's the O-ring go, and all that sort of stuff. And so there are sort of why you would have one of those on your shelf if you either don't take any car apart or not even that model. But they've got such a reputation. There's a few quirky ones. So they've got the Avro Lancaster bomber and the Spitfire fighter plane and a few others that aren't things likely to be parked on people's driveways.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty sure they do bikes as well, but they made the name from cars. And, I also thought their lumping together of stories rather than novels with plays and poetry was a bit of a cop-out.
Why? You think there's a different
Well, because although a play can be poetical, it doesn't have to be, and partly because even when you read one, even if you go down all the way as they suggested, in terms of, I think they mentioned Othello first from memory. If you read Othello and you read the dialogue, rather than necessarily all the detail of any stage description that's been added by the canon stroke tradition sings, then you can read it as a straight story. It's not that poetical in that context, as opposed to you try and read Macavity, The Mystery Cat, or almost any of the other Ogden Nash, Old Grey Posse's Book of Cat Poem or something, without getting poetical, sort of in the beat, sing-songish type stuff.
Yeah,
you'll have a hard job. The same way as you can't read that many Beatles songs flat. You start to sing them.
yeah.
You can speak Bob Dylan ones, and you can speak Leonard Cohen ones to an extent. But you might not be able to do it in Hallelujah, but you might be able to do it in How the Light Gets In or something. But you can't do it with all of them.
Yeah.
Whereas novels, if you take something like The Story of Gendron, all the way down to Zavetan's We, you've got such a range of stuff. Why would you think about it even in the context of one chapter?
Well, I was, one of the things that I wonder about is, if he goes, I mean, they talk quite a bit about Shakespeare, and I'm wondering if it is a different experience to read Shakespeare rather than to watch Shakespeare. Because it never really strikes me that, when I'm watching or listening to a Shakespeare play, that, oh yeah, they're, it's like, who is it? The bourgeois gentleman, right? Who discovers that he's speaking in prose, right? So it doesn't occur to me that they're talking in iambic pentameter with rhymed couplets, in a Shakespearean play. So I wonder if that's, if there are things that, I guess what the question that I'm leading to is, are there things in the structure that are sort of, that enhance our reception of it, or enjoyment of it, or memory of it, or whatever, that that we're not aware of. And this, and this maybe goes to the, to the mnemonic, devices that, that the Iliad and the Odyssey, kind of demonstrate.
Well, I suppose that there is, in that context, there's the film version, the two big film versions of Henry VIII. There was the Laurence Olivier one of 1939, 40 or something. And then there's the 1980 or 1990 Kenneth Branagh one, where the one that's in World War II, some of it's on a Elizabethan stage. And if I remember rightly, that bit's filmed in black and white. And then they do the sort of the bigger scenes, the battle scenes, out in the field in colour.
Mm.
And there, of course, you get something vastly different than if you'd have just seen it on a stage live.
Mm-hmm.
And you also get it different again than if you've seen the Kenneth Branagh one of the 1980s, 1990s, whichever it was. So they've used the medium in a very almost poetical way, really, I suppose.
But does that enhance? Does that enhance what Shakespeare did, or does it?
Well, I think it enhances a plain reading. If you just read in a book, Henry V, as much as I might like the St. Crispin's Day type speech,
mm-hmm.
when I'm reading it in the whole book, because I'm in the flow of the book, I just go through it. But I probably half as many, if not, probably most of the time I've ever read the St. Crispin's speech, it's been the speech on its own.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he does have that section that he mentioned specifically that you should try reading, and I think he uses Shakespeare as his example. You should try reading, this material out loud,
mm-hmm.
and that will automatically bring to mind the idea of a directorial voice. They don't use that phrase, but there's certainly since that time, auteur theory and media studies and film studies has popped up.
Mm-hmm.
But a director who's doing this play, because it was meant to be a performance and not just read as a book. But I think he mentioned, I'm not sure if it was because I've been looking at the 1940 version, the 1972 version, and then I've seen big chunks of their series of 14-minute videos.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was in the 72 edition, which we're all reading, that he talks about a scene where somebody has, there was like a whispered conversation, and then somebody comes in and repeats the line. And that, if you're a director, you have to make a choice of, did the character hear the prior conversation that line is in reference to?
Mm-hmm.
And he knows what he's walking into, or has he not heard that line and he's totally
mm-hmm.
lost?
Mm-hmm.
And so there are directorial things that you get by playing in. Separate from that, because it's kind of interesting. It's a little tangential, but it's interesting with respect to it. But in Knowledge and Power, Lynn Kelly she's talking about oral traditions and oral culture, and specifically at many sites, and I think it ties into their Adler's discussion too. In one of the places he discusses, when you're watching the play, some of the chorus will be on heels and taller and dressed as if giants.
Mm-hmm.
but she talks about transmission of knowledge being done in certain spaces where you will have the speaker or the transmitter of knowledge will be either up and above or showcased in certain ways that the lighting is different, or that the way they speak and the echo of their voice going down into a chamber and then back up makes it seem as if they're larger than life,
Mhm.
which also helps one's memory because you see this thing done in a presentation that's not two people standing on the ground next to each other as everyday thing, but when it's done as a dance or performance or some of these kind of speaker thing, if you it's like going to a modern lecture hall, you've got the person up on stage up and above in a louder booming voice to a bigger crowd, that becomes a more memorable thing.
Mhm.
So that kind of spoken part kind of plays in there as well, which I think talks to that bit of your question.
Mhm. Well, and I do, and I think that varies quite a bit from staging to staging, right? I'm thinking of all of the different versions of Hamlet I've seen, and I remember there was one. It wasn't at the Olivier where Olivier actually sort of editorialized the whole thing in a way that was kind of unsatisfying. Doesn't that one begin? This is the story of a man who could not make up his mind. Which is sort of like, okay, now I don't have to watch the movie.
Yeah, it becomes irony. Or if you think of modern, like big stadium concert tours now, those things become spectacle as a means of, so it's, you can listen to a song on the radio and have a great emotional experience, cranking the tunes up, driving down the street at 85 miles an hour. But it's a whole different ball game when you see it at SoFi Stadium with big massive screens rebroadcasting, and it's even louder than your car stereo can go. But they do it so that it's more memorable. It's a better experience.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of equivalent of that, of reading, sitting down and reading a book, which I guess is its own experience.
But well, I suppose the other one is where it's quieter in terms of performance, and of a rock concert example. That is, how memorable is it reading a script from The Wire or from The West Wing or something? And it only really becomes memorable with repeat. Because both, Newsroom or The Wire or even the Band of Brothers say, Band of Brothers is a book made into a script that you now remember the script executed in the TV series probably better than you do reading the book, because you've got all those extra visual clues and you're in the throw of the story with no effort on your half except to follow the story. You haven't got to read, you haven't got to interpret the words. You're just going to watch where the camera points. And that's what the TV shows you. And and you said about listening to some of this stuff on audiobook when driving. And I sometimes wonder, audiobook while you're sort of walking around the house doing a hoovering or something might be okay. But given the amount of cognitive ability required to drive versus, albeit in town, I'm thinking, rather than necessarily on the eye, whatever it is, it's no traffic. Versus you've put yourself away, you've sat down in your favourite reading spot, you've got your cards next to you, you've got your favourite pen in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, and you're focused on doing I'm going to read this, highlight and take notes as appropriate.
Mhm. Yeah,
Well,
I
where-
do think
where
that I guess
Where's the
yeah,
consumption? Yeah.
I think I got less out of these chapters by listening to them than I would have had I done exactly what you just described.
I mean,
but I am
go
planning on
ahead.
going back and doing that, right? So I don't think it's a question of one or the other.
Well, I almost would think too, it's an affordance we have now that didn't exist in 1940 or 1972.
Mhm.
You have the ability to do your first like rough read through on audiobook,
Right.
and you can do it at multiple levels of speed.
Yep.
Fast or faster than you could read probably with your eyes. And
Mm.
you can absorb and let the text wash over you and through you
Mhm.
to get the first bit of interest and find what they call, the unity of the material,
Mhm.
so that you can then sit down and go through it with a more fine-tooth comb, and you'll have at least heard bits. And I use the bookmark function when I do that.
Right.
And I'll then go back and highlight a couple pieces or write down a quick note. And then as I'm going back through it again, with that second read of a fine tooth, but
I mean,
that presumes
guess-
you've got a piece of material that's worth doing that second read with. Something
Yeah.
that's audiobook and you're done.
Yeah, I think that's.
I guess
the way to do it.
true for most people anyway. But I personally would do the first reading if that is necessary, just speed reading, because I can do that pretty fast anyway. So
Yeah, I think I usually use I was trying to use other things that would actually maybe that had more tech magic to them, but I just started using like voice memos. And, when I just stop. I'll listen to something. I'll stop it. I'll do the voice memo thing. But one of the things that struck me in the I'm sort of going to change the subject now, and just mention that when I was going, in the history section, at the end of the history section, they talk about digests, and it reminded me of what we had talked about. Or what we had read recently about, kind of the propagandistic elements of Reader's Digest, that came out of the Oreskes and Conway book. That this thing that Reader's Digest, from their perspective, when we were reading it in there, it was like Reader's Digest is all about propaganda. That's what it's for.
yeah, I personally the first time I read the book, I have not read it the second time totally, but I think I skipped most of the how to read specific books chapters, simply because I think that those are more practical and specific, that I thought I would just come back to them whenever I need it, whenever I'm going to read such a type of book. That would make most sense to me, instead of trying to memorize every single book type to read beforehand. I think that would be inefficient, so I don't think I've read most of them yet.
I think there were some interesting elements. It was, for me, it was more kind of it was about things that they had observed sort of on their journeys through these books. So it was valuable, for me, even though I'm not necessarily gonna go read a book on mathematics right now.
No, that's Chris's job.
Some of the things.
You definitely can't do the audiobook version of the kind of math books I'm reading. So, although to me, the section on all these types of reading, the interesting piece for it is they've given you this set of rules in parts 1 and 2, and then part 3 is here's a bunch of examples of the types of things you might read. And I would presume some readers would tend to stick in one or more of the many lanes that they've chosen, whether you're just reading fiction all the time or you're reading nonfiction. I think a lot of people tend to like get in one lane and stay there, and then they may dip into other pieces. So my guess is Dan reads a lot more nonfiction stuff and not as much, and to a lesser degree fiction and almost not at all poetry.
Yeah, it's been
not
I can't remember when the
that's-
last time I picked up a book of poetry was.
But they sit by doing that, they're providing now lots of examples of how to apply those rules that they talked about in the first half to give you experience with, in a sense, applying them yourself.
Mhm.
And it's a very interesting pedagogical structure for why they've done that. And then that becomes the whole third section is a get used to how to apply these rules, because I think in section 4 we're now gonna go really deep.
Mhm.
And you'll need to have had some experience playing around with these rules to do the thing we're about to show you next.
Right. And can I just mention that Nate seems to have joined. So, hey, Nate. And what I one of the hey, how you doing?
Wow, nice library.
One of the things that struck me about it is that it is it kind of humanized them for me, right? Like, oh, this is now they're talking about what they have done, the ways that they have read and that it kind of, because at first, if you recall, I was kind of a little bit annoyed at, sort of the professorial or magisterial kind of tone that they were taking in the early chapters. And now it's gotten more like, oh, this is why, this is how I do this, and this is why. And then, by the time, and like I said, I listened to it all the way through. By the time they get to the end, when they list, and they actually list their, whatever it is, 125 or so, chronological great books. They're very much, they seem to be just much more human. They're just, they're just like a couple of guys who are saying, these are some books, and they actually kind of pull back, and they're very modest kind of about it. And I say, exactly what you just said, Chris. People, find the place that you're comfortable with to start. You don't have to, you don't have to do this in a particular way. You don't have to go outside of your comfort zone, that sort of thing. And these will not necessarily be your great books. And they actually sort of introduce that idea that that everybody will have their kind of their own set of great books, and they define great books interestingly. And maybe we should talk about this next week, but it interests me because it's like the books that you will come back to and come back to and come back to, and you will not feel like you're wasting your time when you do, because magically somehow, as you've improved your ability to understand them, these books still have something for you to understand.
If we expand up on this mixed media method of getting through books to pick and delve into, I'm wondering, there's obviously a fair bit of or at least since this book was originally written, even since the last edition, there's obviously been a whole load of Mark Grabe type research on how to read.
He's got his own genre.
Yeah, but at the moment, I wouldn't know at the moment without sort of spending half a day with Research Rabbit or something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that anybody's actually bothered to say, well, if you take that old dead tree process, then what if we did it with mixed media? Partly, let's say it was Matthew mentioned a moment ago about either speed reading stroke or doing the audio book as the fast skim. Then you go back, if it passes that first hurdle, let's look at the contents of the index as they describe. Now I can search for those words outside of the index as well, to see where else they mention it, because I've got an electronic copy.
Hmm.
Where's the new methodology workflow for reading a book that is with all the tools, as opposed to just the eyeball number one on a pen and a piece of paper?
Mhm.
That would be somewhat interesting to delve and dig around and see if anybody's done any actual numbers on it. Talk about math books. I mean, they haven't actually really said about reading science papers in the construct as they are now versus the science book. You know, are you going to read Galileo Simplico, or are you reading a collection of stories by Stephen Jay Gould on evolution? Which one's a science book?
I thought it was interesting when he said, the style of the two discoveries is not conducive to the content. Because I remember last week, one of the things that occurred to me was I think the narrative of his disagreements with when I was listening to Eric Weinstein, right? His narrative of his disagreements with the string theorists was helpful, kind of, to me in saying, okay, I know that this guy has is kind of staked out this claim. Michio Kaku is here, and and Brian Greene is here, and so so that I don't know if that actually gave me accurate information or just kind of gave me a place to stand and say, well, okay, I can kind of see some outlines. But that was interesting, that that there are different kind of forms, because I've been thinking about that a lot with history too, about the narrative as argument. So that's been kind of rattling around in my head for a few weeks.
The one that I suppose is getting at me is the last, or parts of the last 3 or 4 books. There's all been sort of, outside of this one directly, have all been at the edge, if not explicitly, within economics, of which is something that outside of that filters into everything.
Mm-hmm.
I've never really bothered with, and outside of being able to run some decent business-sized spreadsheets, I've never really worried about it. And it's like, okay, so GDP is, yes, I know what that, and retail price index, yes, I know what that is. But then if I had to go and describe it closely, the actual details of the retail price index, or the details of GPT, not necessarily on the tip of the tongue, but should be at some point. And so it was like, okay, so who is, or what is the Austrian scholar?
Mm-hmm.
They get mentioned, and I recognise a few names from other stuff, and I've been involved in some chat about it, but no great depth. And that was the one thing I was hoping that would come out of Walworth's book, was a bit more, but can't wait on Walworth. You have to go into the Jason Hinckley stuff to get more of, let's put this up side by side with more traditional economics and what's spoken about in the newspapers, in the magazines, etc. So you can match it up a lot more. But it'd be, Interesting, I suppose, to get next version of this book needs to accommodate multimedia reading consumption. It's not really reading it, consumption.
Well, and that's the thing, is that the next version of this book needs to be not less than this book, in the way that, because when you're Tim, when you're saying, you kind of get Austrian economics, the question that immediately jumps into my mind is, but at what level? Is it is it Hayek's book, or is it the Reader's Digest version of Hayek's book, or is it the cartoon version of Hayek's book? Because I have tried to read von Mises' book Human Action, and it's thick. I don't think, and actually after I had read it, that was, and that was when I was very, enthusiastic about that stuff in the 80s. I heard Ronald Reagan say, von Mises is my favorite economist. And I was like, don't even say that. You have no idea what von Mises was about.
That's why you need some business group with a point of view in the mid-century to be bringing your economic ideas to you on a silver platter and taking in and choosing the pieces of the theory that they like, that work for the corporate capitalist greed machine, and not for the actual. The last book we read, I think there literally was a section, hey, they were cherry picking ideas from these books and leaving out the things that actually said, hey, we don't even agree with ourselves on some of
all the nuance and all the qualifications and all the complication. Yeah, just falls right out.
Because you need that. But if you don't read the book properly, which, and I almost guarantee you, Reagan did not read that book the same way you read that book. If in fact Reagan even owned a copy.
He ever read it, yeah.
Or he probably owned a copy and it was probably signed, but he probably never broke the spine.
Right. That's probably true. And he probably, He probably if he got anything, he got a executive summary that some assistant or some intern, prepared for him. It's and I guess the question in my mind is, and I'll come to this from a different direction. So go ahead, Tim, and then I will. I
was just going to slap Chris for insulting you that you break the spines on books that are hardback copies. Glued paperbacks that you roll up, I can understand. Yeah.
I found this on my shelf. I wasn't even really kind of aware that I had it until.
So you already had a copy of How to Read a Book?
I had a copy.
What year is that one?
It is. That was weird because it wasn't what I expected it to look like. That's why I didn't see it. It is 72. It's a Simon and Schuster reprint. Yeah. So
no mention of Touchstone in there.
Nope. Oh yeah, it does. It is. It's. Yep. I think this was Touchstone. Yeah, it does say Touchstone down there. Yeah, so this must have been at the very beginning of Touchstone's existence, before they had really broken out.
Is there a co-author on that book?
It is Van Doren and Adler.
Okay.
Yep. Oh, yeah. So it's the 72. It's the one that that I was reading online from the Doc Drop folder. I think it's pretty much word for word.
You're managing your library properly when you find the book you're reading and it's an extra copy while you're reading it.
Yes.
Nothing better. Like you are properly managing your personal library, Dan. Life is unlocked.
Well, and the funny thing is, I had it. The reason that I found it was because I moved all my books back from my campus bookshelves, in my office that I've just moved out of, to home. And so, yeah.
So the anti library.
Yes, the double anti library. So yeah, and I so what I wanted to say was was kind of about. I had a question because when I went down to Mankato and I did these two presentations yesterday. The first one was about textbook affordability, so mostly about open educational resources, and the second one was about Z Degrees, which is this program that we're pursuing. In the first one, I was much more autobiographical than I typically am when I kind of present these ideas, because it was for faculty, and I wanted to sort of make the case that it's not that daunting, because that's been something that's been an objection or a hesitation point, is like, oh my God, I have to write a textbook. And so I sort of diagrammed the way that that I had done it, and and it was from like lectures, right, become scripts, and part of it had to do with having been on YouTube and having realized that I can't really speak extemporaneously. I have to have a script in front of me, right? And so it occurred to me that that 10,000 words is X amount of time in a video, right? And like an hour, actually, really. And then so then there was this kind of this trajectory for me to go from from PowerPoint slides with sort of highlights on them, with that I would expound on, and then that would become then I would expand, give more examples, and it would become a text. And so what I was thinking about as I was listening was going in the other direction, right? That whole idea of, are we, if Ronald Reagan doesn't read Human Action, but he gets an executive summary, how filtered is it? Can we make any types of, can we have any type of expectation that, even the right kind of top level things will come out of it? And that's why I think everybody's notes are different, everybody's highlights are different, everybody comes into it, and that's why I was really leaning that much into that whole what's the goal of the individual is reading question at the beginning of this process a couple of weeks ago, is that I really don't think that I kind of understand the world that they're sitting in as they're saying this, especially Adler in the 40s, or the late 30s when he's writing. But, and then Van Doren too, probably, actually watching a couple of those videos, the age difference really fascinates me. But that's a side thing. But yeah, that whole, there was an idea at a time that these are the things that you should get out of it. And like I said, they back at the end of this book, they back away from that a little bit and say, not everybody should get the same things out, as if there's a list of things, and if you don't check all of these boxes, there's something wrong with you. But they're on their way to that. It's not really, it's not like complete cultural relativism either. So it's an interesting tension.
But
Yeah.
then you've also got, what can you benefit from in terms of, you've got a subject to read, not necessarily a particular book, and then you go and use Blinkist or something to do their 5 books on the subject.
That just scares me.
What I'm actually wondering is if you could use Adler's methodology or even his book to learn how to read a book like this.
What is that?
Principles of Neuroscience, 1,700 pages.
Probably.
Yeah, I doubt I would use Adler's methodology to properly read this book. I would use more sophisticated learning techniques. But yeah, I was really doubting that.
Well, so you wouldn't. So are you saying that you would avoid their advice of understanding the structure of it and sort of reverse engineering
No,
it into an outline?
no, not that. I mean,
Okay.
can you still hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
Because it looked like my Zoom was freezing, hence I verified. No, I would still use that. I have integrated that in some sort of other methodology, but I think I would skip or replace or modify in some way most of the ethical rules they have, because I think they are more suited towards what I would call intellectualism and really, really understanding a book on a deep level, but it would take eons for a book of 1700 pages. I think I would use more like what Dr. Justin Sung teaches in his YouTube channel and his course for a book such as this. So a combination of inquiry-based learning and mind mapping, not the conventional mind mapping, but the way he teaches that. I would probably use that and learning in layers actually, which means I would start with like the logic of the book, which is or the topic, because you don't want to make a mind map of the core concepts of like a 1700 page book, more likely one section of it. Just find the 6 main concepts, figure out how everything relates to each other in that sense, and then by asking questions, go deeper until you hit the granular details. Because knowledge to stick onto, that is something that is also explained in like Smart Notes and other note-taking methodologies. So you need to start somewhere that is easy, which is not details, but more the broad, high-level conceptual logic. So.
Mm-hmm. So we're speaking, since you just mentioned Matthew, Smart Notes again. Nate, you had said in the chat that maybe the next version, maybe the evolution of this is to Smart Notes. Do you think that did enough justice to this process? I mean, I've been thinking about, if I was going to and at some point I probably will like revise.
I'll be right back. My Zoom is not responding, so I need to close.
Okay. Okay. See you in a minute. I would think about, kind of going through and really thinking about these things, and maybe saying some more to my students about, about ways of reading. It might be something that you could combine with a Smart Notes. But I was actually trying to form that in the form of a question. So I'll stop.
Well, but it's also, how are you approaching the reading? So in Matthew's case, he's got the big textbook, but his intention from the start is to learn the shape of the things that are in it. And once you're into a topic that's that deep, or you're working and looking at a textbook, that textbook is going to be scaffolded in such a way that we're going to cover everything as in depth as we possibly can as the state of the art. So it's going to be better structured probably, and not structured in such a way as we're going to make an argument, and when you're done, you're going to have a new perspective on life because you've read it.
Right.
You're going to have a whole lot of new knowledge. So you probably won't do the inspectional reading because it's probably been assigned and you're taking it for a class where you need specific. So you're either going to consult it for 2 pages of knowledge, or you're going to go cover to cover roughly.
Yeah.
Let me interrupt you for 1 second, actually.
From the start rather than the other.
I'm not reading this for school at all. I'm actually reading this for myself, for my theory of education and to understand more about learning. I also bought it myself.
Yeah. So there's maybe an assumption that that this encompasses a field, right? And so by reading this carefully and squeezing all of the juice out of it, you're going to, at the other end of this journey, understand at least what whoever the authority is that was the textbook author or the authoring committee or the editors or whatever think is the field, right? And then you can expand on that and and argue against it or add to it or whatever you want. But you've sort of that seems to be the expectation when you held it up, that's part of it.
Well, You've also presumably, and if you're reading it for that purpose, and it wasn't assigned by a professor for a class who did the work for you, which honestly I think is a piece that's missing, is Adler and Van Doren are coming from a perspective of, we have a list of great books that we're going to recommend to you, but if you're doing it for school, my guess is that you looked at a handful of books and you did an inspectional reading of 4 or 5 other competitors in the market for that space. And you did that inspectional reading at the stage of making a purchase, but knowing you had the intent of, I'm going to give it a more thorough analytical read right from the start. So you did the pre-read super fast to make the purchase. And then now you're skipping right to the end and you're doing a much more in-depth reading of it. But I kind of wish they had brought out that fact of, and in early book history, you may have only you're studying physics. So Almagesty is the only textbook that's going to be out there. You're not going to find another textbook in that space as an alternate. So you only have the one. So you have to choose the standard textbook. But now, 10 centuries later, you've got a whole lot more options of what you can pick and choose to read. So I always like to read stuff that's totally not on the syllabus. What did the professor leave out? He or she is giving me a perspective on the material that may be good, but I may have different things I want out of the class. So I'm going to study the other things that aren't on the syllabus to see what can I get out, because I want what I want out of it for me, not necessarily the check off all the check boxes to get the A. The A in the course is great, but I want the education. I don't want the A in the course.
Yeah, exactly.
More than the education. Ben, that's 90% of what's wrong with education is most students don't know that's an option. It's not presented to them.
Well, and that's really kind of at the key, or at the center of this transition from, accredited educational institutions to all of the knowledge and information and wisdom of the world being available to people in these other formats. And how do we value that? It was interesting, kind of, because it's been a couple of years since I had read the Jaron Lanier book, and he tends to be kind of, in both of his books, You Are Not a Gadget, and then Who Owns the Future, he tends to be kind of a little bit snarky and cynical or ironic, but also even when he's not doing that, he tends to sort of not describe his train of thought adequately for me. So point A, he goes from point A to point Z without kind of showing the thought process in the middle. How does A lead to B, lead to C, etc. And so I have to kind of try to reconstruct that myself, which sometimes is a useful exercise and sometimes not so much. But this idea, but I want to understand, whether or not the things that he's just tossing off as conclusions are kind of well-founded or not. But this idea, one of the things that had sort of stuck out in my mind was that he had said that, it's sort of ironic that, that elite education is becoming astronomically expensive and putting people in lifelong, debt that they can never discharge, at the same time that all the information in the universe is becoming available for free. And that there's some, and that there's a relationship there that we should examine.
I mean, what in that context, what I personally hate is that in the country of the Netherlands, but probably in a lot of countries, that formal education is, first of all, still obligated. And second of all, that there is a social aspect to it, that most people are or either conservative or they just do not know that formal education is highly inefficient. For me, it would be much more beneficial to just educate myself because I know how to do that. Formal education wastes a lot of time, but one, it's obligated, and two, most of the people around me, they would warn me not to quit education, even if it could be, simply because it doesn't work. But I know it does work. So
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because we have, I mean, there are some elements of being in a community and having mentors or having people who have gone through the process before you that can ask you questions that will help you sort of clarify your own thoughts, or they can do all kinds of sort of, that can play roles. It's kind of interesting. I'll give you an analogy. One of the things I did while I was down in Mankato was I visited my son, who's an undergrad there now, and and so we ate at dinner, and then we had breakfast the next morning, and then I went and did my thing and drove home. But he did a couple of years of this PSEO, the post-secondary education option, instead of high school at the college that I teach at. But previous to that, he had been mostly homeschooled. And so he's sort of mad at us for that. He feels like he missed a kind of a socialization in high school that he, in it not having had it, he kind of values, and it has that the grass was greener on the other side of the fence sort of attitude toward it. And I've tried to tell him, I understand why you feel that way, but trust me, you really didn't miss anything. But the thing that occurred to me was that the difference between being homeschooled by your parents and having a teacher in a school is kind of exactly to the point of what you're saying, Matthew, is that the parents make all of the mistakes along the way, right? And never have that opportunity to learn from the mistakes that they make and then to use them again with the next year of students, right? And so that's the big advantage of teachers, is that they have, not only they've been trained in it, but also they've had experience, kind of guiding people through this thing. So I think that there is, that's an important role, as we think about higher education falling apart, that we need to figure out how we're going to find this in the new order.
Yeah, I definitely agree that mentors and the teachers in that sense of the role are highly beneficial, especially when I look with my limited history or knowledge of history, like at the Greek and Roman times. I think that a lot of people were highly educated there simply because they had a protege role to a master of the craft or something. So I definitely agree that is super essential. The issue I have with the current efficiency of education, primarily in high school, because that is the actual school I have gone through. As for other things, I have no context yet. But what I think is the primary issue is that first of all, education does not teach how to learn in an efficient manner. When I would ask teachers how I should learn, I'd often get like highly inefficient methods, or not an answer at all. And the highly inefficient methods would be like flashcards or something.
Right.
They just don't know. And second, on top of that issue is also remains the fact that you are in a system-paced system, or a system-paced education, which is not efficient for me at all, because I actually do the research on how to learn. So I could probably, if we're talking about high school, I could probably learn in 3 months at home what I could learn in 5 years at school. So that's to me just a major waste of time. And the issue is because education does not teach how to learn, the teachers themselves also don't know how to learn, because they also, that is the vicious cycle, they also don't have the time to learn how to learn because they are having a much too high workload. So if you just break that cycle and start teaching how to learn efficiently, a lot more could be able to solve, I think.
Yeah, I think there are a whole lot of things that are done for reasons that are not about learning, right? I mean, when you think about in America, most of the high school history teachers or social studies teachers are coaches. And really they're, and in a lot of cases, their major priority is being the baseball coach or the football coach or the track coach, right? Not teaching history or social studies or geography.
So,
And the
so
best
there
part
is
is most of
so-
their salary is the teaching, and only a tiny fraction of the salary at the high school level, anyway,
Mhm.
is the extracurricular.
yeah, but that was the meme about define your university. Who's the highest paid
Right.
member? If it's a
Absolutely.
sports coach,
Mhm.
you're a sports academy with some education attached, not. But it's the one thing with homeschooling, and for your son, Dan, in particular, is being homeschooled in part by a parent whose parent is a teacher and themselves are a teacher at some point. So it's the thing that I know that on the few Americans, particularly Americans that I've met that have been quite bolshy about, oh, I'm homeschooled. So I said, okay, so what about this book? Oh, I never read that. Oh, what about that one? Oh, I never read that one. What book did you read? And so far, two of them, bless their cotton socks, have both come up with exactly the same book. And it also is the only book. And it's like, so are you really telling?
Yeah.
Are you really telling me you're getting all of what you're spouting about now, about the DNA, etc., and the evolution of life and how DNA arrived and all the rest of it, just because you've read Kings, Joshua, and Emmanuel?
Right.
Really? And it was because everything's in there. I said, okay, so show me where in the Bible are the 4 Galilean moons.
Mhm.
And it stops the conversation.
Yeah. Well, when they, sort of like when they revise the Bible the way that we're thinking about revising Adler and Van Doren, maybe they'll put those in there.
Yeah. Maybe they just attach it to Wikipedia and say, read this one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, it was funny. Wikipedia. I was thinking about. It was weird how Wikipedia has changed in the last couple of years. And it's kind of weird that I had read this Who Owns the Future years ago. I guess it was probably written in must have been written after 2008, because it talks about the financial crisis, and it talks about Graeber's book Debt, first 5,000 years, which was a surprise to me. It was sort of like when I probably first read it, it was before I had read Graeber. But then and then it's talking about, and then it was talking about social media, and then less for-profit things. And he talks, change over time. That's my thing. Then he was talking about sort of these nonprofit things, and he was sort of warning that these might also become what he calls siren servers, right? That they are that they're kind of bending reality, and that they're not to be trusted. And I thought, wow, and that's why I kind of want to go back and sort of try to connect the dots, because it was like that was a conclusion that I hadn't come to the first time I read this, but the last year or so of Wikipedia has suggested to me that is something that even that is problematic.
I'm curious, Dan, when you say Wikipedia has changed, what is that change that you see?
It used to be that there were always editorial fights, but now in this age of kind of disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. There seems to be much more of a there seem to be organizations that are that are deploying people to edit and alter pages on a really regular basis to make to make their own points and to create a reality if people believe that that Wikipedia reflects reality that serves their agendas. And it used to be, I mean, there used to be kind of this claim. I remember when I just started grad school down at Mankato in the master's program, one of the things they had us in an intro class, they had us write an essay about can we use Wikipedia? Should we use Wikipedia? Can we trust Wikipedia? And my feeling at the time and the argument that I made was, yes, because of this sort of democratization of anybody can edit, and
that's precisely the reason
that
why
will somehow protect the truth, or at least kind of get us closer to the truth. Nowadays, I think there is now I'd be much more suspicious of that. Now I'd be much more suspicious that there is that there are very well-heeled interests who are deploying people to watch and control what's on a lot of pages. Not just pages on COVID or the war in Ukraine, but just kind of general. And it's weird too, because what I'm seeing is and I've mentioned this before probably, I'm seeing a lot of people who are sort of grabbing hold of history and trying to deploy historical understandings to support agendas in the present and the future, political agendas.
I mean, that's why I would personally also not go to Wikipedia to do research or anything. The only reason I would use websites like Wikipedia is mostly just to gain an introduction to something or a field and to scope it out so that I know which books or other sources to get on the matter. I think that would be a more effective use of sites like that.
I almost always use Wikipedia to find out birth and death dates. People, if I'm gonna write about Herman Melville, okay, I want to say his, I want to parentheses birth death. I can find information like that. I mean, that doesn't seem to be too fraught with controversy. But but anything else, yeah. And Gamergate actually probably, that's probably a moment, Tim, that things started to change as well.
Well, I mean, one of the things, particularly if we're going back into the big myth and the American myth, even the two earlier books. One of the things that comes through, particularly if you follow Naomi's work with Jeffrey Serpin, he did a lot of the work with her at Harvard about the effectively what we would now call the Exelon papers about we knew this when,
right? Who
knew this when, and what are we going to do with it? Are we going to shove it back down the gas side of the oil pipeline so that we can pressurize some more oil out? Seems the obvious thing to do with it. And there's a whole bunch of people, including DW something, which is a German-based journalist group that's got quite a good selection on sort of green environment stuff, all the anti-climate stuff as well. It includes an interview with Jeffrey as well. And it's clearly, if you go and grab the Wikipedia page for the Heartland Institute or whatever, and then go back in a couple of years' time and do the same, see what's changed.
Yeah.
One of the things for the UK, I mean, you've got, if I remember rightly, you've got either the C ring or D ring, which is where all the lobbyists are for Washington, DC. in the UK, we've got a street called Tufton Street, and particularly 55 Tufton Street. And there's a bunch of researchers there that, depending on which day of the week, will depend on who's their employer. So they all work for about 6 or 7 different think tanks.
Wednesday, it's the tobacco industry.
Yeah. But not quite. I work for that think tank on Tuesday and I work for this one on Wednesday, and they sort of overlap.
Mm-hmm.
And so they often end up by quoting themselves, but don't put themselves down as the author. They put the institute down.
Oh, nice. That's
in the paper. So absolutely. So you very quickly can build up a research rabbit type.
You don't even have to wait for the New York Times to pick it up.
Yeah. You could build the web up quite quickly. And then you go, okay, so when did these come out and who actually wrote them? Where did they get their source information?
Mm-hmm.
But the downside, of course, is some of these places also get a very good veneer of open and free academia by having the likes of the Economist end, stroke historian end. You've got the likes of Niall Ferguson is on some of them. And then they've also, and with Niall type people, they also do, we do 2 days a month for the Brookings Institute, not just the Hoover.
Mm-hmm.
So
now Ferguson is the Steven Pinker of history.
And so what's Steven Pinker of? So what do you believe Steven Pinker is of? When Stephen is being Stephen of what?
Oh, what is his? He's probably got.
It's a neuroscientist, right?
Is he really a neuroscientist though, or is that just his his chosen field? Is that where his actual educational credentials are?
I'm not sure. I
so.
have only heard of him.
Yeah, it's funny because you hear, I have heard something said. I do remember reading something. I don't think it was about Pinker. I think it might have been about Harari and Jared Diamond that said, these guys don't actually have the credentials that you think they have. This just happens to be the field that they've decided to kind of focus on. Since you were talking about the Exxon papers, it reminded me that that Marion King Hubbard, when he kind of famously described what we now know as or we now think of as kind of peak oil, he had there was a whole nother thing that he said sort of about the growth economy and about the commitment to growth and the addiction to growth, and how that we can't if we can't sustain that, then then this whole project is going to fall apart, which people don't, it's almost like the Eisenhower military industrial speech that nobody reads anymore, but maybe people should, because it was a kind of a cultural critique as well as a, sort of a, this is where the U.S. oil.
Are you mentioning this Harari?
No. What's his name? Yuval Noah Harari.
Oh yeah, no, I don't know them.
Yeah, the Israeli guy.
Yeah,
who's all over YouTube interviews as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the guy you just picked up, Matt, his credentials have been trashed because he cheats and he lies and he has the walls removed.
Oh, interesting. I don't know that.
Or at least that's what his Wikipedia page says.
Who is that guy? I didn't even. I noticed that it wasn't the Harari I thought about. I didn't know who it was. Who is he?
It's Jonathan Harari or Harry. I don't see it, but it's a book I picked up. I haven't read yet. It's called Stolen Focus. I've only picked it up because I saw it mentioned in, I think it was one of FP's videos, and it looked interesting. That's why I bought it.
Cool. Okay, so we're a little bit off the how to read a book page, but but and actually, since we're 90 minutes in, should we make a stab at what it is we want to talk? Should we just finish it next time? Because the big thing next, for that we would talk about next week would be probably the Syntopicon.
The syntopical reading, you mean?
Syntopical reading with a small s and with a big S, which they do distinguish, and they say, syntopical small s syntopical reading is big, and big S syntopical reading is you read the Syntopicon and you kind of learn from our exam, sort of thing.
Yeah, that fourth part is actually pretty short compared to what we read for this week.
Yeah, but I think it has a lot of good stuff in it.
The other thing we got to do is, I don't know if we had a little bit of discussion of what the next book after this is, but that's also a topic. I
think I'm going to stay at the at the book club. I like it.
One of the things I did notice, and it irked me when I did my kind of overview reading of this book. And it irks me even more now as I try and go back into it for things. But this book has, and some people may not get to it and may ignore it altogether, but this book has the worst index on the planet. So, it's got lots of books of great names and philosophers and their works. And it's great for that. And you pick it up, and if you were to only judge this book by its index, you'd be like, oh, this book is about, the Western tradition.
Yeah.
And only that.
Mm-hmm.
But what's sad is you can't even pick it up and find the 102 great ideas interspersed through that.
Right.
Which I would think they would have bent over backwards to do, particularly in this edition. But when you pick it up, and I did it earlier, specifically looking to find, because Dan had mentioned Oresky's and Reader's Digest and propaganda. So I literally picked it up and looked in the index for propaganda, only to find that is missing.
Oh my God. You're right.
And I was like, what? WTAF, pardon the phrase.
That's true. It goes right from Protagoras to Proust.
And I'm like, and so there in a nutshell is my major problem with this book. You know.
Maybe they didn't make the index themselves.
Oh no, assuredly they made this index themselves.
Yes.
You're talking about people who are professional indexers for a living.
Yeah.
These guys made this index themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. I mean, I'm going to be sort of pursuing probably, and I'm not saying that I'm proposing this, but I'm going to kind of be pursuing the Syntopicon itself, and probably reading, probably actually going through the,
I mean, I don't think that the Syntopicon is a book or a book series that is applicable to the book club. Maybe the individual books in the great books of the Western world, but not the Syntopicon itself. I've taken a look at that. That's not a book you want to discuss.
I think I want to follow through the. I want to watch them do it, right? And so I, from the perspective of, and we have talked about sort of reading articles in the past. And it might be, it might be something to do to kind of look at the maybe the Life article, maybe some of the stuff again about Luhmann. I don't know that we want to do another note making thing in the middle. Right now, one of the things that we can do now that we couldn't do before, I suppose, is that we have, since we have this digital copy, this digital set of, of the great books of the Western world, we can probably keyword search it on archive.org in a way that, even they wouldn't have had, been able to have done in the past. So that might be kind of interesting to, to do that, and then to, and then what I want to do is I want to kind of look at their process and then extend it, using modern tools, and see if there's, they did, towards the end, they do get a little bit, as I said, to me, it seems like the tone changes a little bit. They get a little bit more modest. They say, oh, you'll notice that this is Western, right? We don't have Asia really in this set. And they explained it, right? They said, first of all, neither of us is an expert on Asia, right? So we'd be kind of shooting in the dark. And then they continued to say, and we don't feel that there is a single canonical set in Asia the way there is in Europe. And so that's at least an interesting point. But it did seem like, it does seem like, I kind of at least want to give them the benefit of the doubt and sort of,
what I would like
see how that
to
goes.
exist is a manual on how to create some sort of syntopical, because I would love to make such a thing for the field of education and learning, simply because it's my life's mission anyway, and I will spend my whole life doing research into it. But the
Well, that's what
problem
I'm
is
saying
that
is,
I found no material to find that process. So
well, I think that's what this whole project has been, that I've been sort of working on as I've been reading these, note making books and stuff is sort of in that direction as well. And so,
I mean, if we can reverse engineer it, I would be highly grateful.
I was only half kidding about an update of this, of this volume, How to Read a Book. So I don't know but what other things,
Well, I'd like to talk about the math chapter.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about the math chapter.
I'm going to be a little harsh here, but I thought it was an embarrassment.
Okay.
He analyzes the structure of a math book based on axioms, and that anything you prove is going to be an if-then statement. If the axioms are true, then this is true, and that's all he said. He mentioned using a pencil once to write in the margins. And the most infuriating thing was that reading Apollonius and Archimedes was easy. So
and Newton,
really
right? Oh, Newton.
I'm sorry?
And Newton.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
We could talk a lot about Newton, but he didn't say anything about how to read a math book more than use a pencil in the margin. And I was very disappointed. He didn't apply anything in the first half, and look at it as a set of arguments and things like that. I do agree that older stories about science are really just for historical value and not necessarily good about current research. But the math part was just ridiculous. And I was quite surprised. I mean, Adler's a very smart guy, a philosopher, and he, maybe should have bowed out by not being an expert on that either. Chris,
Yeah.
I'm sure you had something to say about the math section too.
Yeah, well, Apollonius and Euclid are a little easier to read than, let's say, Hungerford's algebra, at least for the average person. But the issue too is you can pick up Kant and start reading Kant without having read any other philosophy and get some way into it. But you cannot pick up, Thomas Hungerford's algebra without having had scaffolding and structure to build up to it to get what's going on. Otherwise, you're going to be painfully lost, and it's going to be a futile exercise for the average person.
Yeah.
And the same with Archimedes and Apollonius. Unless you have a good solid footing in Euclid, you're not going to understand their stuff either. You're right.
Right. Well, he did say read Euclid.
He did.
So Chris, you've been looking at the 1940. Is this section, this how to read math and science section in the 1940, or is that a later edition?
I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know, because I haven't compared that.
Okay. I'm just curious because he seems to talk a lot about, this, looking at the, Lavoisier and looking at, and looking at Euclid and looking at these people kind of for their look at the author. We're interested in the authors. We're interested in, not the rightness or wrongness of the science, which may have been superseded by now, but and in a way it's sort of, so the reason I asked if it was in the 1940s was because it's sort of, I was comparing it to what Kuhn said in 1962, right? That, that we don't read, that science students don't read the Principia, and they don't read Lavoisier, right? They just read, the newer, truer things that, that have encompassed those things, and of which, Einstein is a, Einstein includes Newton, so you don't have to read Newton anymore. But
well, there's, I think broadly, if I remember the preface to this book, most of what's in sections 3 and 4 is entirely new compared to the 1940 edition, but I haven't compared those.
Okay, in that case, then it's after Kuhn, so they have no excuse.
But I think what's missing too now is, for a modern reader, and maybe it was not so dramatic for a reader of the early half of the 20th century, maybe, but it's dramatic now for a kid growing up in the modern world who is being, even a 3rd and 4th grader, are being taught science in ways that they would be wholly lost without having the context of the broader history of science to go back and read some of the greats, because the framing of life and knowledge in the Middle Ages and even into the Renaissance is so dramatically different than how we frame those things now, that you're reading totally a foreign language.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I did appreciate that he did say math is a foreign language, or at least made the analogy, but it's a language you only need to learn once instead of twice. Because
that didn't help me. I mean, it was cute, but did that really help?
But I think a lot of people, I literally, when he got to the math section, the gloss I made on it was, I have a tag that I use, math shaming, that I usually make heavily in popular press news articles. Anytime math is mentioned, it's almost always framed as the first math is hard. And it drives me fucking up the wall, pardon the language, that everyone says math is hard, because everyone starts from that framing, which then reinforces the cognitive bias everyone has, that math is hard, and it's not.
Well,
it's not, you're not making an effort if you think.
But as stupid as it comes, I mean, we say about math being a consistent single language. It ain't, because you've got, especially if you decide that what you see on the page is part of the language as opposed to what you hear. And what I mean by that is things like the Newtonian notation for calculus versus the other guy,
Leibniz.
Yeah, Leibniz, right? And there are only so many X's, right? And it's like engineering uses I for imaginary. No, they don't. They use J, because I is impedance for electrical engineering.
Oh.
So all of a sudden, it's like saying, "Oh, I want to have breakfast." No, you don't. You want a small meal.
And Eric Weinstein started using Hebrew characters in his equation.
Yeah, but that's what a Google is, or a Googleplex even, right? Because they've run out of other letters, right?
Well, so the other thing that's happened, right? And Chris and John, how does this relate? Is that science now uses a lot of math that, when it was first discovered and written about and elaborated, was thought to be just math, right? Matrices and vectors, are now used in ways that were not anticipated, when it was pure math. And now all of a sudden it's sort of like, oh, pure math is the language of nature. We just are only beginning to understand kind of how it works. So what's going on with that? How does that relate?
I mentioned it before that the enterprise of advanced physics has stalled in the last quarter century, roughly. And it has stalled because there isn't a runway of mathematics that one can then use to kind of reverse engineer the physics.
Mm-hmm.
And most of physics moved so quickly because you could be doing research and then you had a ready language that was already explored and played out that you could point to and say, we can do quantum mechanics specifically because, complex analysis and matrix theory have existed and gone so far so quickly.
Right.
But literally the state of the art of math and the state of the art of physics are roughly co-equivalent now. Not completely. But the other problem is, to function as a bleeding edge physicist, you need to have a PhD equivalent level of math in one or more areas that is equivalent to your PhD level of physics knowledge. And individual people having both of those at the same time is exceedingly rare. And that literally caps what you're capable of doing. So 9 times out of 10 to do physics these days, you need to be a physicist, but you need to collaborate with a mathematician, and the two of you need to be able to speak together. But if you look at graduate physics books and graduate math books, the language and the notation in those two areas is not always the same,
Mm-hmm.
which makes it that much harder. So those two people, because they're speaking, to make it easier, let's say they're speaking 2 different dialects of math.
Mm-hmm.
And those dialects make it that much harder for them to speak together. And then there's another dialect even in the fields of engineering, because engineers use math in not only a different way, but a much more fast and loose way that isn't always, a mathematician looks at the math an engineer does and would scoff because they're not doing it right.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with that if you limited when you use the word math to applied math, because applied mathematicians are way different than pure mathematicians. Like your algebra book, there would be more of a pure theoretical math book. And there are areas of topology that no one has thought of how it might apply to anything yet. But that's always something that's up for the future grab. My favorite story going back 100 years in the history of science and math is, which is easy to describe, an algebra 1 principle of a quadratic equation. They usually have 2 solutions. And in some cases, one of the solutions is negative. Well, depending on what you're applying it to, you might throw away the negative. Well, physicists were always throwing away the negative solution. And then somebody had the bright idea, what if it meant something? Because they were looking at the total energy of the universe. And that boiled down to, strangely, a quadratic equation. And the negative solution led them to start thinking about antimatter. And it became a new theoretical concept to explain something about the universe. So in many ways, math will precede physics in that way. But and there's been articles written about the sort of a surprising application of math to the physical world. No one really expects that to happen.
So I literally I just started a class on ring theory and modules because that's what one does. And John, actually, if you're bored, there's a professor at UCLA who's been doing like upper level undergraduate and graduate classes in math just for fun for decades. And most of the classes all aerospace engineers, retired physicists, and engineers, because Southern California is full of them. And
Yeah.
there are like 15 people in this class just just for fun. I find almost half hilarious that
What's the professor's name?
Mike Miller, he's a former Rand researcher, and he did his PhD at UCLA under Basil Gordon in the 70s. And he's an algebraicist at heart too, even though he's done other stuff. But he he essentially said something this week that kind of put it into that framing that you mentioned, is, and I wish I had the direct quote. I should have written it down. I'll have to pull it up. But he literally said kind of that same thing this week. And that was like, okay, there you go. And there it is.
So was there anything in the math section because some of the things that seemed I seem to think they were kind of really impressed with was kind of this idea of propositions and demonstrations. And is
that wasn't too bad. I don't know what the intended audience would be. Yeah. If it's just a layperson, then maybe you ought not to be reading a real math book. Maybe you should be reading people's essays about math or how fields connect. So maybe that was the intended audience, and then it just came out.
Well, it was weird because they didn't convince me to go read Euclid, I have to admit.
Oh, yeah.
So so I'm not, and if I was going to go read, Gödel, Escher, and Bach, Hofstadter, I have not actually read that.
But I think the missing thing, and I wrote it as a separate note earlier in the week, because I always think about the math there's an exploration in math that is missing from math education in a general sense. And instead, we educate math the way you read new math. So most books, most technical math texts will start with, here's a definition of a thing, and you learn what that is. And then usually there will be maybe an example or two of what that definition is. And then that's followed by a theorem and a proof. And in practicality, that is not the way a working mathematician does anything. They will play around in an area in a sandbox and tinker around and reach into their toolbox, and they'll play around with something until they come up with a result that seems interesting. And then they retcon the whole process, and then they create a definition out of the thing they were talking about to make it clearer. And then they do the thing. So typically you would go the opposite direction, and you'll start with examples. You'll create a definition, and then you'll have a proof, and then you'll end up at a theorem. But instead, it's presented the other way, that here's a theorem, here's a proof, and it's based on this definition. So
I think that would be interesting in a narrative form.
Yeah.
To actually tell a story about doing that, and also about the motivation to do that, about why somebody would, because it does seem like an alien world.
Yeah. But it's the same type of thing that engineers do. You sit in the lab, you play around, and you figure out what's going on, and you're guided by what science can tell you.
Mhm.
But there's more play and creativity involved. And I think most people who look at math see, you'll see Thomas Hungerford, and it's, this is a lovely, maybe not as magisterial as Sergey Lang's book, but it's, that is an edifice of a book that will get you through algebra in one of the quickest, shortest paths you could possibly imagine. But the difference is you can spend maybe a year and a half and write this book if you know what you're doing. But the creation of this book is a century of mathematics condensed to a fine crystal. So if you're learning it, yes, it's great. But if you're trying to figure out how to be, or how to teach someone how to be a mathematician, we're doing a dreadful job of it, because from third and fourth grade, no one is being taught to explore and figure things out. And you can, when I look back at it, Gauss could write a huge amount of math, because at the point he was writing, there was so much great low-hanging fruit to be had by just exploring the space that you could discover everything. But as a young math student now, the amount that you can discover that hasn't already been discovered is almost zero. So you have to get to the graduate level to be able to find the new stuff. And when you can't find new stuff as a third or fourth grader or an eighth grader, and so teachers are teaching you the great crystallized form, but they're not teaching you how to explore and be creative in a mathematical space and kind of go that direction. And to me, that's the whole enterprise is wrong, because we're just teaching you what we already know rather than teaching you how to be creative and inventive and explore the space. And then once you've done that, okay, here's how others have crystallized that. But how do you teach kids to do that without, putting the cart in front of the horse, I guess, is maybe the best way to state it. We just don't do that in math education. Instead, you're just learning what others have already learned in hopes that you can get far enough that you could be the creative person. But
I think that's actually exactly what the guy is saying in the paper I just shared, or the article or whatever. He's saying, if I remember correctly, because I read it last December, he was indeed saying that math is less about like pre-existing knowledge and more so actually about creativity, about expressing oneself. So I think your argument is exactly the same as what he's saying. But I might be wrong, of course, because I'm not a math expert myself.
Yeah, which sort of leaves the question: is this section that we've just been reading, helpful, or is it actually the opposite of helpful, because it seems to be separating these things into, okay, for this discipline, this is how you do it. For this discipline, this is how you do it. And, and we got math and science followed by philosophy. And then they roll into theology, which is like, okay, now you're way off the reservation as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I thought the first half of the philosophy part was I don't know, trivial. It might have been good if you were reading the philosophy of Anaximander and Thales.
Yeah.
But from Plato on, it becomes very technical and very deep. And I don't think he hit that. The second half of the chapter I thought was good and might be beneficial for a lay audience to dive into philosophy. It's not going to help you read Wittgenstein by no means.
Yeah. It did. The second half of, if by the second half you're saying the stuff after Plato, after their five styles and all of that.
Yeah, the styles were interesting.
Yeah. Then they go on and they talk about, sort of this, and I wasn't really convinced that the five styles were necessarily conclusive, right? That this is a closed set, right? There can be no other way of expressing, sort of philosophical inquiry.
You
And then
look
they
at
go to
Wittgenstein's
theology, and then they go to
Tractatus.
canonical books. So it's a question, so then there's this question of authority, right, which they never want to seem to deal with.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I
But-
interrupted you.
Well, at least I think the styles gave you a hint, because one of the things you look for is what kind of book is it, and I mean beyond philosophy, is it Kant's The System of the World, which no one writes today, or is various styles. So I thought that was interesting in order to classify the kind of thing that you're reading. How you classify Wittgenstein's Tractatus versus investigations is it wouldn't fit. So you're right; it's not exhaustive.
And then and then when they get to social science, they come back to this idea of stipulating your usage, right? Which is kind of which rolls all the way back to their discussions of terminology and coming to terms and things like that.
Well, when I read that phrase too, I immediately thought, what would Adler and Van Doren think of our kind of current state of misinformation and how we got here? Because in some sense, when you may stipulate things, and I think it's in much higher relief on the Sunday morning political talk shows, like Meet the Press. There are stipulations that those people come in, and these days the stipulation is I'm this party or this party, which totally informs every one of the talking points I'm going to say.
Right. So grab the vocabulary set from that.
So we talk about the talking points instead of the underlying assumptions that are totally wrong on one side or the other, So we've created this worldview that there's a set of right or wrong assumptions that you then build from. And if you don't go back and re-examine the base of those stipulations, then you can get a huge amount of trouble really quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're in that same sense, then I'm wondering, what do you think about citing or an ID or citing an author or using one of his ideas or concepts that he's written about without being able to, with certain reasonable certainty, saying that you actually understand what he's trying to say? Because I think if you do that, then you can be actually creating more misinformation. I think you must be able to say that you understand what he's trying to say before you use it, unless you specify something.
Well, and especially next week when we get to syntopical reading, right? Not, we're going to, they're going to make the point that authors are using terminology differently, and part of the job is reconciling that so that when they're talking about what they, and when they're talking across, past each other, or when they're actually talking about the same thing.
I mean,
that's the big,
The reason I asked this is because I remember that I had a discussion with Bob Dotto actually about this many months ago, because I was actually forcing, or not really forcing, but I was really advocating for the point that you must be able to understand an author, or at least his point, before you try to use it publicly and cite it. But it seemed to me that in that discussion, Bob Dotto was more about, I'll just take what I can use myself. I don't care about what the author means. And I think that's illogical, at best, and in that discussion, and unethical at worst, because you actually misrepresent someone without, So that was an interesting discussion I had back then. Bob Dotto and I don't really like each other, I think.
Yeah.
Well,
it looks like we're out of time.
Yeah.
Final thoughts. Close it out.
I'll wrap it up, because I'm kind of curious, and if anyone knows, other than we have a tradition of dialogic, especially in philosophy, of talking, and then there's authors and readers, and they talk about a conversation going back and forth. But I'm curious, outside of their version of the Syntopicon and syntopical reading, what those things look like in past history that they would have come up with it. My initial guess is there are, in the 1800s, German scholars who were studying the Bible started looking at what are known as the synoptic books of the Bible and comparing them, the three against John as the outlier, I guess. And it's not a big jump from synoptic gospel study to syntopic, which are very close. But that practice is essentially doing the same thing that German scholars were doing.
It reminds me a lot of kind of what I had heard or read about sort of Talmudic scholarship and that's that kind of thing, both in the era of both in the modern era, and I'm thinking my sources for that would be people like Chaim Potok writing about it in his fiction, but also things that I've read about the Kabbalists and the people who lead around Spain, who sort of are more or less contemporary with Spinoza, and there does seem to be a kind of a tradition of that sort of read. I mean, it's bounded within the faith tradition, but I mean, it seems kind of analogous. So next week, shall we just finish it?
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that's
There's not that much left.
Yep. All right. Cool. And so mostly we'll be talking about syntopical reading, the ultimate goals. We're gonna get to the ultimate.
yeah, and it's rather short.
Yeah. Yep.
And then what, think about what's next.
Yes. Yeah. What is going to be next? One thing that I've been, again, I've all of a sudden gotten fascinated with, and I don't think I've put it in here, was, Taleb, which
You mean
might be
this
Early
Taleb?
Taleb or
Other
late
Taleb?
Taleb?
yeah, Nassim Taleb, yeah, Fooled by Randomness, Black Swan, Anti-Fragile, and he has sort of defined himself as being just stuck on this one idea. I mean, and it's like, okay, it's a guy who discovered something in math and is trying to find all of the applications in the universe for it, possibly, fat tails, and which strikes me as interesting because that's a couple of decades ago, that's what sort of the chaos guys did, right? I remember James Gleick and his chaos book, and it was all about sensitive dependence on initial conditions, and it was like, wow, we've discovered a thing, or Prigozhin, and the what's his name, the guy who I just reviewed on my blog, Alf Hornborg, kind of elaborate, taking Prigozhin into economics and ecology. It's interesting. It's interesting to kind of follow these ideas and see how far they can go. But anyways, So why don't we do that? Why don't we in the book suggestion thing? There's a lot in there, so I'll kind of try to.
Maybe someone should optimize the book suggestion list with something like classifications and categories to make it a little bit more readable.
I'm not gonna. I was thinking Karl Popper when the Open Society and its enemies popped up earlier. Yeah, that might be fun.
Usually about now is when I go through that list and I reorder it based on the number of votes.
Oh, okay. So why don't we do that then? Why don't we
You'll
vote?
notice that list changes and shifts around, and it's usually me going through, like, I let it be chaos while we're reading a book, and then just before we decide to pick, which
Yeah,
is
that's
why
useful.
right now, like,
That-
make your suggestions and then or votes.
Well, we should acknowledge that. That is a huge public service. Thank you.
But it happens and no one notices or cares. But I I jumble it up from time to time, but I try and do it in such a way that nothing gets lost. So
Cool.
that's the harder part.
Thank you.
Gotta be careful in cutting and pasting.
I mean, there are backups on Dropbox, like file history. So I think that if anything goes wrong, that could easily restore.
Yes, yeah, I have. I've only had to use them once, but yeah.
Or if you wonder why your great suggestion that was at the top it moved way down, it's because it had one vote.
Oh, so now we're getting to Wikipedia editing.
Yeah, well, or it got moved down, but it usually got moved down just before we chose a book, so that all the big vote stuff was at the top, and then I'll move it back up later on. So
Fair enough. All right, cool. Thank you. Good discussion. Welcome back, Nate.
thanks, Dan.
See you next week.